So as we all know, budgets for documentaries these days, they're shrinking. So in this video, I want to give you 3 ways that we have been using old narrative tricks to try to make our films look a little bit better. These things have really helped us, and my hope is that it's helpful for you in some way, then you can apply it to your films. All right, the first one is locations. This is the #1 way that we've been able to increase production value. The bottom line is boring locations can really affect how people experience your story, and it's a missed opportunity when we don't use a location to give the audience exposition to the story that we're trying to tell. The background of an interview is a great way to give the audience information without having to do a lot of extra work. So here's some examples of some locations from our films. This one we had to work for because it was really hard to find a place for the camera and set up the lights, but as you can see, his character is consistent with the locations in the story. Now this shot was really hard to plan because what we didn't know was most of the prison cells that they were supposed to be empty, but when we got there, they were full, so we had a live audience of 300 people in a maximum security prison, and the talent had to be really cautious of what they were saying so they didn't say anything stupid that got them in trouble. All right, so here's 4 tips on how to make the most of every location. First, take the time to scout. Even if it costs you a few bucks, whenever possible, try to visit a location beforehand so that you know what you're walking into and what gear you need to deal with, that situation. All right, next is sound. You might find an epic spot for an interview, but it sounds horrible. Remember, people will put up with bad picture, but they will change the channel if the sound is distracting. All right, the next is lighting. How can you use light to make the most of bad locations, but also understand that this can take a lot of time. If you can find a great location that you can use natural light with little lighting setups, this will allow you time to focus on the story and your interview questions. All right, next, look for locations that help you tell your story. Is the place you're shooting helpful for the audience to understand this person better? We subconsciously understand that if a person isn't in an actual place, it says something about who they are because they're there, they got access to this place, and that they belong there. All right, the last tip is to think outside the box. Be willing to move furniture and items in the room. Just let people know that you're doing it if you need to. You would be surprised at how many times people clean up their home and make it all perfect for you, and then we come in and we want to move the couch, and then people just start to panic. We've done this, and we found TV remotes and cereal boxes and embarrassing things that the talent didn't know was under there. It's a horrible way to start out an interview. All right, so the bottom line is just ask people before you do it. Next is wardrobe. This is one of the best ways to help your talent increase their value within your film. What they're wearing is communicating who they are to the audience. Wardrobe can create instant authority and empathy for your characters if they're wearing the right thing. This is an easy way to move your story forward without having to explain who they are. For instance, having a pilot in a flight suit allows us to trust who they are before they ever say anything. The same goes for locations. So here's a few tips on how to make the most of your wardrobe. First is we communicate with people in our films well before the interview to bring 3 shirts. Most of the time they're really appreciative that we're paying attention to the details. It's also important to remember that we want them to wear things that match the story that we're telling. If they're wearing a suit in a factory and they're a welder, this is totally confusing. We want to explain really clearly the exact story that we're looking to tell, and that we work together on something that they're wearing that they agree on. Our clothes often is our identity. Next, let them know not to bring clothes with logos or whatever on it. Oftentimes, organizations or presidents of companies and things like that, or nonprofits, they'll think it's a good idea it's just a good PR move to wear a golf shirt with a logo on it, but what they don't realize is it kind of comes off cheesy and promotional. Next, bring stuff in for an emergency. I can't tell you the number of times that I've pulled out jackets and given it to the talent because they didn't have something that worked. The problem with that is sometimes I'll give them the jacket and then they don't want to give it back. All right, the last tip, bring lint rollers. This has saved me like 100 times. What people don't know is that a hair on a black shirt can look like a snake crawling across your chest. It's pretty epic, and I wear a lot of black clothes, so I see it all the time when I'm doing YouTube stuff. All right, the last way to increase production value is props. I'm always looking in the room for props to put behind people in interviews. You know, there's been many times where we're looking for a certain prop to put in an interview simply because it'll tell the audience something about the story. You know, for instance, in this interview, I was able to show this person as a bike mechanic without ever having to explain it. In this one, the plane in the background let the audience know we understood history. It's an historical plane that matches the times of part of our story that we're trying to tell. It married the past with the future. So here's a few tips on props. Think about the props that you want to put in your film before you shoot, and put the extra effort in to bringing these things to locations and figuring out what you need. So oftentimes it's just planning. All right, next is give yourself time to set dress the background of your interview and your scenes. You know, people will appreciate your attention to detail. You know, for Red Horizon, we spent a significant amount of time moving planes and different things in a flight school to better tell the story. All right, next, find small props that you can put on tables. It just adds context to the scene and the story. You know, this goes for interview scenes as well. People may not realize that you did it, but subconsciously they're taking in that information and you're helping tell the story. All right, next, plan your interviews and scenes in places that provide props that tell the story for you without you having to do anything. You know, do some location scouting beforehand. You know, it makes things so much easier as you're telling your story if you plan this stuff beforehand. All right, last is, before we go, I want to tell you a few things that we've learned as we've been implementing this over the last few years. You know, don't get overcommitted to any of this stuff and forget that spending too much time on this stuff takes away time in your schedule that you're actually interviewing people for your story. All right, next, be aware if someone is uncomfortable in what they're wearing. You know, it will show up on their face. You know, make sure that their wardrobe brings out the talent's confidence and not make them really concerned and anxious. All right, last, make sure props are elegant and not overt. You know, this is often the problem with branded content like Red Bull, you know, or a shirt with a big logo on it. You know, you just know ahead of time that they're trying to sell you something, and it kind of takes you out of the story. All right, Yeti Films does a good job with this, so if you want to look at their films on YouTube, it's a great example. So let me tell you why I think this is so important for the business side of impact documentary filmmaking. When it comes to distribution of your film, you have to have a great product. You and I both know that. You know, if you don't have a good film, it becomes really hard to find someone who's willing to pay to watch it. You know, for us, locations, wardrobes, and props, you know, have become a big part of how we try to increase the production value of our films and not increase our budget. All right, thanks friends. I hope this is helpful, and like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.